G'day, listeners. You are listening to the Natives Rouseabout podcast. I'm your host, Michael. I'm back. And today with me, I have the ANA National Governor, Mr. Grant, and he'll be joining me to discuss a little bit about Russell Ward's book, The Australian Legend, as well as the 1986 movie Crocodile Dundee. How you going, Grant?
Yeah, terrific. Good to be back on, and I think we're going to be doing a couple shows in the near future, so people should get a bit more material this month or this coming month. So, yeah, glad to be on.
Yeah, it's a busy time. Happy Easter to all those who celebrate that holiday. We're recording right after Western Easter, and it's going to be a busy week because there's also the National Convention, I believe it's called now, coming up.
Yeah, that's right. National Convention 2026 coming up in the following weekend. It's going to be a blast.
Yeah, so I'm sure we'll have a debrief of that one in the future. But anyway, why don't we get on to our topic today, a little bit about these works before we get into the poetry and so on. But for those who haven't heard of them, they're both sort of cult classics, similar subject matter, but very different mediums. So Russell Ward's book, it's kind of a history book, but it's a history of the development of a kind of view of the archetypal Australian. So the legend is meant to be this kind of bushman from the outback, and that's kind of exemplified, I think, in some popular works like Crocodile Dundee, which is why we're pairing these two together. So for those who don't know the book, you probably have seen the movie or at least some snippets of it. So that will give you a bit of an idea of what's coming up. No listener comments or none that are worth discussing anyway. So let's jump into a poem. Now, this poem is originally a song, and it's one from the 1905 Banjo Paterson collection called The Old Bush Songs, which is a collection that helped inspire Russell Ward to develop his thesis on the Australian legend. So that's why we are going with this one today. And the text is called The Murrumbidgee Shearer. So the Murrumbidgee Shearer. Come, all you jolly natives, and I'll relate to you some of my observations, adventures too, a few. I've travelled about the country for miles full many a score, and oft times would have hungered, but for the cheek I bore. I've coasted on the Barwon, low down the Darling too. I've been on the Murrumbidgee, and out on the Paroo. I've been on all the diggings, boys, from famous Ballarat. I've loafed up on the Lachlan, and fossicked Lambing Flat. I went up to a squatter and asked him for a feed, but the knowledge of my hunger was swallowed by his greed. He said I was a loafer, and for work had no desire, and so, to do him justice, I set his shed on fire. Oh yes, I've touched the shepherd's hut for sugar, tea, and flour, and a tender bit of mutton I always could devour. I went up to a station, and there I got a job, plunged in the store and hooked it with a very tidy lob. Oh yes, my jolly dandies, I've done it on the cross. Although I carry bluey now, I've sweated many a horse. I've helped to ease the escort of many's the ounce of gold. The traps have often chased me, more times it can be told. Oh yes, the traps have chased me, been frightened of their stripes. They never could have caught me, they feared my cure for gripes. And well they knew I carried it, which they had often seen, a glistening in my flipper chaps, a patent pill machine. I've been hunted like a panther into my mountain lair, anxiety and misery my grim companions there. I've planted in the scrub, my boys, and fed on kangaroo, and wound up my avocations by 10 years on cockatoo. So you can understand, my boys, just from this little rhyme, I'm a Murrumbidgee shearer, and one of the good old time. That was the Murrumbidgee Shearer. Quite a few little references in that one to different topics in Australian history, many of which we've covered. What did you think of that one, Grant?
This poem speaks to me on a cellular level. Not only have I fed on kangaroo, but I have also bathed in the Murrumbidgee River since I was a child. So it's very, I suppose, a homely poem. Though I haven't fossicked in Lambing Flat, but I've I guess one thing with bush poetry for me, at least individually, I really took to bush poetry in high school, in my later years in high school, and much of the bush poetry is oriented around that kind of central south New South Wales district, or at least a lot of the stuff. I mean, Banjo Patterson, he grew up in Yass. He spent a lot of time on the Monaro. Henry Lawson, obviously, he doped around Sydney and was travelling out west doing the shearing and the swagman kind of game. So all these poems are kind of real and relevant. They don't sound like a far off place to me. And yeah, I mean, to get to the particulars, of his story, I think he's just showing his credit, being all you jolly natives, I'll relate to you. Like he's giving the story of what he's been doing and what he's done, which lends himself to being a credible native, unlike the kind of the globetrotter who only kind of lives in the city and does commerce and hasn't really lived the Australian experience. Have you really lived the Australian experience if you haven't slept in a canvas swag and been awoken by the cockatoo or the magpie in the morning and sat by a fire at night and watched the stars and with the ambient smell of sheep in the air? And do you know the smell of a shearing shed when you walk into it, or do you know the taste of a kangaroo stew? So I don't know. All these things kind of just speak to me, at least in my own experience. And it kind of flows on to what we'll be talking about today, obviously, with Australian legend and Crocodile Dundee and wider ideas about Australian identity and culture.
Yeah, well, I mean, even the chapters in the book, the Australian legend, kind of follow along this thing. You've got you're starting off with the jolly natives, and he starts off talking about the currency lads, the people who are born, first born in Australia, being white men, of course, as well as the emancipants, so those ex-convicts. And he considers that to be the sort of formation of this bush culture, archetypal bushman character. Then he goes into the gold fields. So, of course, we have here, been on the diggings, Ballarat, Lambing Flat. We cover that in our show on those things. But, Eureka Stockade, your race riots, that's where this character picks up his typical Australian racism, which Ward is very critical of, because we'll see he's a man of the left. But he acknowledges that the typical Australian is a racist. And I think before we go on, it's worth making a clear distinction, which Ward does at the very start, that when he's talking about the typical Australian, he's not talking about the average Australian. So the average Australian doesn't necessarily, traipse around the bush and go hunting and all of that sort of stuff, even back in the day, right? The coastal cities were very British, and you had a large British immigrant population. I mean, they're all British, but, when we're talking about those who identified more with empire and the authorities. But anyway, we've gone from the goldfields to the sort of the Queensland, unions, right? With the burning the squatters' shed down.
Yeah. In the Great Shearers Strike, that's right.
That's that reference there in the third stanza. Yeah, and then the bush ranging. So he's the escort of many is the ounce of gold. So there's a chapter in here later on bush ranging, which is the last kind of chapter of substance before he kind of starts to wrap it up. And I mean, it covers all of these things, so you can see where Ward is kind of drawing from some authentic material. In any case, right. Yeah. Any other words on this one?
No, not really. Look, I think all I would say is and kind of it will bleed into the course of today's conversation. Really, I feel like when this poem, when we were reading it, just how personally it strikes me. It's one of those things, I think, this kind of Australian culture or this bush culture. It is very personal for some people, and then for other people, it's just something that's kind of academic, and it doesn't feel very intimate. And so it's and that can make it very challenging to kind of academically analyze these subjects with total, I suppose, rigor or without emotion, I suppose. Because yeah, it is. This is like, this is the kind of culture that you feel, and not necessarily one that you need a dozen peer-reviewed studies to prove it exists, I suppose. But we'll get into that in the bones of it, I'm sure. But I guess that's all I'd say about this poem. It's something that speaks to your actual lived experience, which you don't need to rely on anything else to kind of justify its sense of strength and its purpose and its meaning to you. So yeah, that's all I'd say to that. I'll let you spin into the next section.
Yeah, well, the next section is just getting to the book itself. And I'm not going to spend too long reading from it because we don't. It's something that you can kind of understand pretty quickly, and a lot of the book is just fleshing out where he's getting it from. But it is worth reading the famous opening of the book that describes the legend, as that'll give people a pretty good idea of what it's about. So, quote: "National character is not, as was once held, something inherited. Nor is it, on the other hand, entirely a figment of the imagination of poets, publicists, and other feckless dreamers. It is, rather, a people's idea of itself, and this stereotype, though often absurdly romanticized and exaggerated, is always connected with reality in two ways. It springs largely from a people's past experiences, and it often modifies current events by coloring men's ideas of how they ought typically to behave. According to the myth, the typical Australian is a practical man, rough and ready in his manners and quick to decry any appearance of affectation in others. He is a great improviser, ever willing to have a go at anything, but willing too to be content with a task done in a way that is near enough. Though capable of great exertion in an emergency, he normally feels no impulse to work hard without good cause. He swears hard and consistently, gambles heavily and often, and drinks deeply on occasion. Though he is the world's best confidence man, he is usually taciturn rather than talkative, one who endures stoically rather than one who acts busily. He is a hard case, skeptical about the value of religion and of intellectual and cultural pursuits generally. He believes that Jack is not only as good as his master, but at least in principle probably a good deal better, and so he is a great knocker of eminent people unless, as in the case of his sporting heroes, they are distinguished by physical prowess. He is a fiercely independent person who hates officiousness and authority, especially when these qualities are embodied in military officers and policemen. Yet he is very hospitable and above all will stick to his mates through thick and thin, even if he thinks they may be in the wrong. No epithet in his vocabulary is more completely damning than scab, unless it be pimp, used in its peculiarly Australasian slang meaning of informer. He tends to be a rolling stone, highly suspect if he should chance to gather much moss." In the following pages, we shall find that all these characteristics were widely attributed to the Bushmen of the last century, not primarily to Australians in general or even to country people in general, so much as to the outback employees, the semi-nomadic drovers, shepherds, shearers, bullock drivers, stockmen, boundary riders, station hands, and others of the pastoral industry. I'll just read this last bit as well. This was so partly because the material conditions of outback life were such as to evoke these qualities in pastoral workers, but partly too because the first and most influential bushworkers were convicts or ex-convicts, the conditions of whose lives were such that they brought with them to the bush the same or very similar attitudes. Right, so that's pretty much all of the sketch he draws of the legend, right? This bushman. The interesting thing for me here is that you have the academic language, and then he's quoting these sort of, what would be typical expressions, right? Have a go, near enough, hard case, etc. So he's sort of trying to draw from this lower working class element, and which is what he says at the end, right? It's not the coastal people or even rural people in general, but specifically the legend is drawn from drovers, shepherds, shearers, bullock drivers, stockmen, boundary riders, who started off from the ex-convict class. So what do you think of this, Grant? Do you think this rings true?
Yeah, I think so. I think he's done well to qualify it as well. As we've already kind of touched on, this idea between what is the typical versus the average Australian is a worthy point, and he seems to qualify it well by identifying that there is actually a divergence in this cultural genesis. There's the people that are on the far frontier in the most extreme conditions, which leads itself to developing this stronger sense of unique qualities, which we call the type, the Australian type. And the degree of the permeation of these cultural norms through wider Australian society obviously waxes and wanes and varies depending on the period of time or the location or even the proportion of native-born people in the country. You rightly noted before that obviously Australia, being a dominion in the empire, had a significant proportion of first-generation British migrants who would not quickly pick up any kind of Australian unique qualities. It takes generations for people to really get seated in to the unique Australian bush or the unique Australian existence, and for those cultural things that were developed on the frontier to really filter their way through to you. So, we're in an interesting period of history. I mean, obviously, Russell Ward, he's writing this in 1974, I believe. And even since 1974, it's really fascinating to look at how much more...
1958, first published in 58.
58, oh, yeah. There you go. Even earlier. So I think he was definitely on the right track in as so far as there was a discernible bush culture that was more obvious and, I suppose, in your face when you're actually in the frontier. And so the most interesting question really is acknowledging that as something that was in existence. How much further did it permeate through the rest of society? And how much did it really break in and change the way things were done in Sydney or Melbourne or the eastern coastal cities, I suppose?
Yeah. I think that is the question. I think an important part as well is where it says that this kind of legend modifies current events by colouring men's ideas of how they ought typically to behave. I mean, I'm pretty much an urbanite. I was brought up in a very multicultural, suburban sort of lifestyle and schooling and so on. So very different to you. As you've told me before, your father took you hunting. You were practically born, with a gun in your hand, sort of thing. So, whereas for me, like, I didn't necessarily grow up with a very strong sense of what it meant to be Australian, but to share what is probably an autistic experience that some of our listeners may be able to relate to, depending on where they fall in the spectrum. I was on an overseas holiday, and I was still a relatively young fellow in my teens, and I was going on a tour, and I said, I can't remember if it's a tour guide or someone else, I'm like, "Oh, g'day, mate," and then this European just really serious is like, "Oh, that's his way of telling you he's an Australian."
It's real. It's actually amazing. Just quickly while I have something fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
It's actually amazing. I've met so many like young patriots, such as yourself, that have traveled overseas, and like before they went, they were kind of blasé about Australian identity, and then they like go to the UK and they're like expecting there to be not any really substantive difference between themselves and the Britons, and they come back and they're like, wow, we actually are quite a distinct people. Like, it's right from the word go. Obviously there's history and shared heritage, and there's some similarities, but I think it's actually quite striking the subtlety of the Australian cultural development in Australia, which obviously we kind of take for granted until you truly go overseas and find out what it's like. I mean, I've never left this continent, and I probably won't until I'm an old man at some point, if there's anything left out there to go to. But I've heard many people basically share this story with me because they always know me as someone who's ranting about Australian identity, and they were kind of not sure about it until they'd gone overseas and found out about it firsthand, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. All right, what have we got to discuss? I kind of covered the average Australian versus typical Australian thing.
Mm.
So why is the typical Australian a frontiersman then, is kind of the question. And I mean, Ward's answer is that it was the currency lads and ex-convicts who are more likely to go bush, and also that not having as much of a connection to, let's say, like imperial loyalty or loyalty to the authorities, they're more willing to kind of try and forge a new life. I mean, that was really the thing for a lot of these convicts. So, for example, in Tasmania, like Tasmania was looked on practically as like being in paradise for these guys. So they've, committed crimes back in industrialized England, in the sort of dirty, squalid industrial cities, and then they come out here and you're practically picking the fruit off the tree, and there's plenty of kangaroo, and so these guys could just go bush, and that's where you get that connection with the bush rangers, I suppose, as well, given that the earliest convicts to go bush were those ones who were escaping from custody.
Yeah, I do think it is just the natural progression of things, really. I think when you grow up in a different environment, which is so far different from what was, a reasonably developed European continent, the United Kingdom, I think it just develops a uniqueness which is only referable to Australia. So that's why you would kind of call them the Australian type, because they're the type of, the British descent people which are unique to Australia, which, you can't go to Yorkshire and find the Australian type. They're only kind of in Australia. But yeah, like why did that come about? Obviously, there's a lot of factors, and Ward rightly says the environment is some of it. Then there's obviously the economic conditions. There's the squatters that were going out and claiming land in the far frontier to try to make a strike at building their own family estates. Something that was basically beyond the pale of imagination for many people in the United Kingdom, ever since the closures of the commons, and the common man really couldn't go and strike out to own his own land. Everyone was essentially a serf, a tenant, was paying rent, and living under the thumb of somebody else. And so that kind of spirit of the squatter, I think, going out to the frontier to claim his own future, would definitely have a serious impact on all of this. That on top of the sparsity of labour and the isolation of Australia from the rest of the world created quite unique conditions for the union movement to grow and become strong, where in Europe, even in the United Kingdom, there was such a large population that it was quite difficult for unions to exact upon employers conditions and wages, because there would be a lot of desperate scabs in line willing to take the work. So there's like a lot of unique conditions. This spirit of unionism obviously spilling over into the ethnic, position of the AWU for a white Australia. There's a lot of things that are all at play. There's also this other idea that in Australia, a lot of the old world divisions had kind of fallen down into this kind of homogenized Australian plurality.
Maybe homogeneity, but anyway,
yeah,
well, I kind of want to get into that point a little bit later in relation to Britishness, because there's a very interesting thing there that might surprise people a bit. But look, I think what you've said has been very interesting, and I would maybe point out slightly cheekily that it's a very materialist type analysis that fits well with Ward's thesis, right? Being a Marxist, the kind of the reason for going or focusing on the workers, because that was not Ward's experience, and we'll look into that in a tick as well. But the reason for looking at the workers as the source of the typical Australian attitude is that he was looking at it from this sort of Marxist class perspective, where it's the workers who develop this new nationalist anti-imperial identity. He doesn't really get into the anti-imperial stuff explicitly in the book, but you could say it's kind of implicitly there based on his Marxist loyalties. But perhaps, to give the Marxists their credit, there are definitely class divisions in societies. And in Australia, I think the class division is a very important aspect to understanding identity, because when we are looking at the convicts and even some of the free settlers like the soldiers, we're not necessarily drawing from the upper class. You would have some like Wentworth, even his father, I think, was a disgraced nobleman. But generally, you're looking at the lower classes of society forming this sort of seed of Australian society. And even my grandmother remembers a time, and this is in the 20th century, when you couldn't necessarily get a top job in a company unless you were considered like a proper Englishman, like an Englishman from the old country. And a native Australian was not necessarily going to have that position, or at least not if there was a proper Englishman running for the position as well. And that's definitely one of those things with the early period. I think the currency identity, right? The sterling with a proper English, right? That's why they had that name, right? And the currency were like this knockoff, fake fake money, right? Monopoly money version.
Fake patriots.
Yeah. So and that did play an influence on a lot of our culture, like the sporting ethos that's mentioned, and Ward mentioned it in that early bit that we read, right where he says, we generally don't, have we're generally knockers of eminent people unless, as in the case of sporting heroes, are distinguished by physical prowess. And I think that's because one of the areas where the currency could show that they were as good, if not better than the sterling, was in these areas like, your cricket and so on.
Yeah, it's true. I think the other thing as well, like in relation to the class question, I think so much of the wealthier classes in Australian history were seeing Australia as a somewhat of a plantation economy where they could go and make their money and then quickly jump on a ship and go back to London and basically live as lords, enjoying the wealth that they've plundered from Australia. And there's many examples of this historically. Where,
even Menzies considered doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's not a new thing. So by necessity, then the people who say, "No, this is where I am forever, and this is where my grandchildren are going to grow up," they're probably a bit more aggressive towards leaning on the identity they have within Australia and seeing themselves as Australians rather than global citizens of the empire. So that definitely would have played a role as well. Just the sentiments you would have if you see yourself being in Australia for 20 years to make your money to go back to the UK, or you see yourself and all future generations of your blood in Australia, probably makes a bit of a difference in how you identify and how you feel about things.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that, right? Like, I mean, I definitely see my family line continuing in this land. I have no intention of fleeing whatsoever. So the white flight obviously has to stop somewhere, and it's going to stop here. Anyway, anything else just discussing the book generally before we get to the next section?
Yeah, well, look, all I'd just say is I've never actually read the book. I've only read some secondhand analysis on it. So no strong comment other than the quotes that you're providing. So,
and I've only just provided one, but the reader can be comforted in the fact that I have read the book and I've got it in front of me here. I picked it up apparently for $4. So that's nice.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, no, well, I think Ward's description, I think at the start there was pretty good, and I thought it was well qualified in this, the average versus the typical Australian.
Yeah,
I
maybe the
think
other
it's
point I'd cover from the book, which is the last chapter, which goes in his kind of methodology a bit more, but is the difference between Australia and the US experience, and kind of why the Australian experience lends itself to a bit more of a collectivist outlook, as he talks about, well, you've got this thing like frontier theory and the influence of the frontier on the development of the national consciousness, and it's kind of this theory that's been built up by this American, I think his name's Turner or something. Anyway, Ward was drawing on this theory, but he says for him, like, the difference is that the American was much more like a small family or pioneer family would go out and have a small family property which they'd be able to develop. Whereas in Australian history, it's much more, as he says, like these nomad or roving bands of itinerant male workers who are looking for wages and getting paid a wage by these large property owning squatters. So that developed more of a collectivist outlook among the working class, where they felt we have to like band together in order to extract some concessions from these bloody squatters and burn their sheds down and engage in a bit of unionism. Whereas in the US, it's more like, well, I've got my property, and, if I don't, I can just go out a little bit further west, fight some Indians, and build my own thing. And then you get this concept of like the self-made man, and everybody can be a millionaire type liberal capitalist outlook.
The other side of that as well, I think me and Trent discussed a few podcasts ago in the Australian School of Economics. In Bernhard Wise, in his Commonwealth of Australia, he basically writes about how state paternalism was like the go in Australia because of the sparseness of distance between people. Basically, with the low density, the low economies of scale, the extremely difficult conditions of the bush, the synthesis view basically is that you couldn't actually just survive on your own. Like, even if you were a squatter and you could go and claim your 150 acres of land out on the far frontier, just due to the natural difficulties of settlement in what is a greatly inhospitable land in many cases, you were forced by necessity to collaborate with your neighbors to a high degree. Like, even the landowners had to coordinate themselves and share tools, share resources. And so it has an environment where isolation and difficulty, bushfire and flood and drought and all those hardships forced literally every class that was outside of Sydney and Melbourne to form a higher degree of collective sentimentality. And so that obviously spills over into a lot of Australian qualities, So, yeah, that's worthy of discussion.
Yeah, the other part of that as well is that starting as a convict colony, like we started off with authoritarian government. So the governors basically had almost unchecked power to the extent that they could convince the military to back them. And whereas the US, right, started pretty much straight out with representative government, and they were sort of fleeing that sort of thing in the cases where they were leaving due to the English Civil War or whatever. So, yeah, you straight away have this sort of more, everybody has a say outlook, whereas in Australia, I mean, sometimes you have Yanks say, for example, on whenever an Australian goes on their podcast or whatever, like, where is this kind of Australian bushranger attitude? Why are you lying down to whatever, like, the latest thing is, the COVID restrictions, or maybe it's going to be in the near future some sort of like fuel restriction or something.
Keen.
Yeah, like, why do Australians just lie down and take it? Why are we such a compliant people? Where has your spirit gone, right? Why haven't you got more of that Crocodile Dundee attitude? And of course, they know Crocodile Dundee because that's like one of our most famous cultural exports. But again, it's like that typical Australian versus average Australian thing, right? Yeah, maybe the typical Australian that we imagine ourselves to be is like the bushranger, but for every bushranger, right, there's like 1,000 convicts that were just kind of getting the food ration from the government store.
Yeah, that's right. And look, with the autocracy of the early governors of Australia, they did so well as well. So it didn't really leave a foul taste in anyone's mouth. I mean, if you talk about Lachlan Macquarie, you know, this leaves a positive thought in someone's mind if they know, obviously, who he is. So the long-standing tradition in Australia is a very healthy regard for our statesmen who were historically have been excellent leaders and have really served the people. It's only really recently, like probably the last 40, maybe 50 years out of, coming close to 300 years, that we've really seen a lock, stock and barrel kind of elite takeover, which doesn't serve the people and are just total scumbags. But yeah, it's a subject for another day. I'll let you go on.
Yeah, look, okay. So then this podcast, like the reason that I had the idea to do it was that I read this piece I came across by historian John Hirst, which I'm sure you know of John Hirst because you recommend The Sentimental Nation. Now, that's a book that I haven't read that you have read, so
explains a few things.
Yeah, got to pick that one up. Now, I don't think he's necessarily like a dedicated radical nationalist, because that's the school of thought that Russell Ward is said to be like a key example of, right? But anyway, I read this piece of his on the Evet Foundation website, although it was actually a republished article from elsewhere. And I found it really interesting, but particularly this extended quote that I'll give, because it talks about Ward's experience, and he was not at all a bushman. So I'll give this quote. So, quote, in Sydney in the 1940s, Ward found a radical milieu: the New Theatre, the Journalists' Club, the Teachers' Federation, and the Communist Party, which he joined in 1941. Reading Ward's account of his life in Sydney reminded me instantly of Graham Davison's depiction of radical Sydney in the 1890s. The Bulletin, the bookstores, the Freethought Hall, the urban environment in which, as Davison insists, the bush legend was born. For Ward, it had to be born again. He was completely typical of his class in being brought up on British history and English literature, which he loved, and learning almost nothing of the history and literature of his native land. As a radical in Sydney, he started to collect Australian folk songs. Until then, he had never heard one. He was introduced to them by a Scottish immigrant couple, neighbours of his in Sydney, who possessed a dog-eared copy of the 1905 edition of Banjo Patterson's Old Bush Songs. He was invited to their home one night and found the Scottish couple and two visiting British sailors singing "Wrap Me Up With My Stockwhip and Blanket." So wayward and attenuated were the conduits for the transmission of the bush ethos. Ward's autobiography, whose theme is the author's discovery of an Australian identity, shows how weak a hold the Australian legend had on the respectable. In The Australian Legend, he argues the opposite against his experience and uses a poem by John Manifold to clinch the case that the noble bushman tradition has captured the imagination of the whole Australian people. For Manifold belonged to one of the old squatting families in the Victorian Western District, traditionally held to be the most conservative and aristocratic social group in Australia. The Australian Legend in itself is a work of mythic power, for it is an account of a revelation, of a moment when a people came to know fully what was previously half known or hidden. Ward wrote so compellingly because he was writing of his own revelation, which he projected onto the nation and backdated to the 1890s. Clearly, he exaggerated the extent of the legend's influence, yet the book itself did much to repair this mistake. Having rediscovered the legend in the 1940s, Ward became one of the chief vehicles of spreading it among the bourgeoisie. The success of the book became the best support for its claims. In his autobiography, Ward ponders why Australian folk songs enjoyed a revival in Australia in the 1950s, but does not offer an answer. An answer would serve as well to explain why his book was so well received. In part, it was because the respectable, or more precisely their children, were becoming less British and more Australian outlook, and were abandoning the standards of respectability that made freewheeling bushmen doubtful heroes. End quote. Now, I think that's a very interesting perspective, and I've underlined some parts of it myself. But what do you get from that, Grant?
I think Hurst is bang on in the analysis there. Like, first of all, I think if Ward truly was making a claim that this kind of Australian sentimentality just flicked on like a switch for the whole country at some point, I definitely would refute that. And I would say, particularly people who are not living in the bush, they may have had some greater degree of connection to Australian identity in the way Ward suggests they would. But I think, he's definitely exaggerated, I suppose, the pervasiveness of Australian interest. Obviously, it ascended a fair bit in the 40s and 50s, and it's noted here that he was involved in a lot of the radical kind of leftist movements in the early 20th century. And so some people might point to this and say, well, Australian identity is just a communist psyop. To this, I would respond, you can only look in the 19th century from the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and look at a lot of the literature that A&A men were putting out about this ascendant Australian identity, the peculiar Australian type, amongst the many others which are actually available on our wiki because we've republished them. I think there's no doubt that there was an ascending sense of Australian uniqueness, Australian identity, as something obviously born of a British UK stock, but is becoming its own kind of culture, becoming its own ethnicity. But yeah, it's very likely, obviously without having read the book, just going off what Hurst has said here, that Ward has probably overstated the amount of influence it's had on mainstream society, particularly among the elite. I mean, I find it very, very, very hard to believe that would have been very, very true, that amongst the elite or the more aristocratic social groups in Australia, that they were lock, stock and barrel, bush nativists in the 50s. I think maybe in the 80s, maybe when we won, the America's Cup and, Australia was just in its, golden era, bicentenary, I think possible, but definitely when this book was written, I don't think that would have been a fair statement to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it captures something about Ward himself in that the convert to a religion is almost always the most fervent, right?
Mm.
And clearly Ward himself, having never heard any of this material, grown up in a sort of average upper middle class family. I believe his father was a school teacher, maybe even in one of the grammar schools, and so like Ward is definitely himself not somebody that would have that sentimental childhood experience of Australianism or this sort of radical nationalist view, but in being converted to it, he's become like the biggest apostle of it. And I think that's one of the key quotes from it for me, from this greater quote that I read before is he exaggerated the extent of the legend's influence, yet the book itself did much to repair this mistake. Having rediscovered the legend in the 1940s, Ward became one of the chief vehicles for spreading it among the bourgeoisie. And that's kind of a key point as well. Who is he spreading it to? He's spreading it to sort of like the greater middle class Australia.
Mm.
It may already have been more so familiar to the bush people, of course, the rural people and the lower classes, perhaps.
It's true. And the convert zeal is real. I mean, you just meet some new young A&A guy who's just heard Percy Granger's Swagman's Promenade for the first time and see how the man who's been denied his heritage, his whole childhood, is instantly the most powerful Australian warrior that you can find. So
It's funny though, because
yeah,
I really like Granger too, but Granger is the complete opposite to this stuff. I mean, in terms of like the Bush stuff, but he still had a very patriotic attitude. But having read a bit about Granger's life, I mean, he was raised in like basically a Nordicist outlook. So the Aldridges, which was his mother's side, like put great importance on the fact that they were like blonde with blue eyes, which is
weird.
something that stayed with. And his mother like taught him from the saga of Greta the Strong, like these Icelandic sagas and stuff. So he had this like, no, I'm not even kidding. Yeah, so he had a full on, very kind of Nietzschean and Nordicist outlook. Yet he did connect with this stuff as well. I mean, when he talked about what was like distinctively Australian about some of his what he considered his best music, like the Hill songs, he said, "Oh well, there's like this democratic attitude in the fact that I use a very strong polyphony, which is like multiple melodies of equal importance. So you can see like the multiple voices of the people in that." And so, I mean, yeah, he kind of acknowledged that Australia has this more egalitarian, collectivist outlook, I guess, which is a part of the Ward thesis.
Mm.
So
I think
even Granger, I mean, Granger, like very important in the English folk revival. So there you've got like, the British international side, right? He's gone and he's doing all this arranging of classic English folk music, which is an interesting point in this kind of folk song rediscovery aspect of this whole stuff. I think this is an important point. And to get into the wider sphere of understanding what nationalism is, you have these other Marxist theorists like Eric Hobsbawm, Benedict Anderson. I'm not sure if Anderson's a Marxist, but Hobsbawm is. And they say, well, nationalism itself is just an invention of the upper class, right? So the upper class invents traditions and then imposes it on the people. So the people have this, what's the word for it? False consciousness, right? Where they don't realize, oh, I'm part of the international working class. So, instead of that, they think, oh, I'm an Englishman or I'm an Australian.
Yeah.
And so Hobsbawm's thing is like nationalism, all these sort of traditions and things are complete inventions. And you can kind of see how he comes to that perspective, even looking at the Ward thesis, because like what's being said here, if you take a very extreme British, like race patriotic view on it, or an extreme, like Marxist internationalist view, it's saying, well, Ward has invented Australian nationalism, right, which nobody ever believed in, except maybe a few like three Bushmen in the 1890s. Right, and then he's invented that and spread it to the Australian people. And I think the thing with Hobsbawm is that he's like far too totalizing in that narrative. So there's like a more, I think Keith Woods has done a podcast on him. Maybe even Joel Davis did a show talking about this guy. But there's like another theorist called Anthony Smith, whose theory is called ethno-symbolism. And he's like, well, yeah, these symbols of the nation or these images like this high culture stuff. So Swagman's Promenade, for example. Yeah, that's a creation of these upper classes, but they draw upon this previous like ethnic folk material that is authentic to the people or the pre-existing nation, which hasn't actually been invented out of whole cloth. So, I mean, you could even look at the Australian flag for that, right? When we're using the Union Jack, it's a unity of like Christian symbolism that's authentic to the people, and like the patron saints that these ethnic groups, the Scots, the English, the Irish have identified with. So anyway, this is kind of like a big tangent out into the theory side of it, but I think it is important. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And look, I think you touched on an important point there about the people who would say that Russell Ward and even, let's say, J.F. Archibald's The Bulletin and Banjo and Lawson were just inventing culture out of whole cloth. I think, like, on an honest reflection of the historical record, I don't think that's true at all. And much of that is highly minuted in detailed A&A publications, which span back, from the 1870s to Federation. much of the living history and the records are there to demonstrate that in varying degrees across the entire Commonwealth, the continent, there has been an ascendant Australian identity, which is unique and can be discerned from the wider British identity or the Anglo-Celtic identity of the empire. So I think that it really shouldn't be up for discussion. The real discussion is this ascendant identity is how far did it really permeate through the mainstream society, particularly in a country where, a third or a quarter of all people were British migrants of the first generation. It's very difficult. I mean, that's if looking at the country as a whole. In urban areas, I'm sure the proportion was far greater. Like how easy is it to truly culturally assimilate people in their first decade in Australia? When the sound of the kookaburra scares them, they think it's a demon of some kind. Who knows? But I do think that he didn't invent it. None of this is invented. I don't think it's invented out of whole cloth. There may even be some artistic liberty taken, which kind of pushes some of these character types a bit further than they might actually be at the time. But much can be said for any culture. I mean, we had at the last National Convention in Ballarat last year, there was a long-form speech about Scottish Romanticism and the revival in Scottish culture, and how much that Burns and all the rest of the authors in Scotland had essentially taken that pre-existing cultural material, that cloth, and had kind of grafted it and expanded it and grown it out and made it more expressed and more clear and more vivid for everyone. I think that's what is really going on here in this story of Australian ethnic identity and ethnogenesis, is that there's this primordial kind of material that's being developed on the frontiers, which is being grafted into more expressed cultural and literary works, which has an unconfirmed degree of permeation through wider society.
Yeah, and I think a key point of that was the former Victorian governor who gave that talk. A key point he always makes is that intentional creation of culture doesn't necessarily mean like inauthentic creation of culture. So just because you are intending to do something with certain material and you want it to be sort of an expression of what it means to be an Australian doesn't necessarily mean that that's sort of contrived or inauthentic. So I kind of agree with that, and I like. That's like the reason why in Victoria we do the Banjo Patterson nights, and we read the poetry and we come up with new poetry and we do all that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, I think that's an important point. But just to take a different tack on it, you're familiar with the kind of the key touchstone, perhaps, of the British race patriotic discussion, this Neville Meaney paper, Britishness and Australian Identity, and just when you were saying that kind of, you're talking about the ascendancy of this Australian legend style identity through Australian history, like the thing that Meaney talks about at the very start of his paper is sort of this like mistake of having a teleological view of Australian nationalism, and this view that, Australian nationalism was always growing towards a desire to be independent of the empire. And then you go back and you read history and you read everything in history as like a step on the way to that ultimate independence. Whereas in his reading of the history, Australians have always sort of attempted as much as possible to cling to the empire. He makes this key distinction between the community of culture, or he also calls it the community of sentiment, which is that feeling of belonging to the British identity in the empire, and the community of interest, which is where we get these like events like, say, Deakin inviting the Americans to send the Great Pacific Fleet against the interests of the British Colonial Office, or even the view that the British betrayed us with their failure to properly defend Singapore. There's different views on the history of that. But anyway, Meaney's point is that Australians have always attempted to cling to the empire, but it's been more a fact that our interests as a political community have diverged from Britain, being on the other side of the world, and also that the British themselves, or I guess the English, the government back in the British Isles, has taken actions that have necessarily forced us to separate from them, and that's the only thing that's sort of let Australian nationalist culture in this Wardian style emerge briefly before it was submerged again by multiculturalism. So in that reading, I guess this sort of bush material is kind of like a minor tradition next to the major imperial identity, and then you've got a little experiment with Australian nationalism, and then boom, like we're in full multiculturalism. So there's no sort of real teleological development.
I think there is a worthy point in all of that about kind of decoupling this idea of Australian ethnogenesis with like radical nationalism or republicanism. I think even if you look at most of the A&A material that was being published back in the day, which was really talking about this newly ascendant Australian identity, they were often tripping over themselves to try to qualify the statement with saying, oh, but we're still, within this imperial framework and imperial identity and da-da-da-da-da. And so I think a lot of people read Meaney and they think, well, like there can be kind of category errors made around, we're talking about an ascendant Australian identity. That does not necessarily mean the kind of radical Republican, like Archibald Bulletin style Republican nationalist. Though, you can make arguments for and against that, whatever. That's not the point of today's discussion. But I suppose, you can trip yourself up, and a lot of the material, a lot of the primary source material for A&A views on ethnic identity for Australians was not one that was just, we're just this whole cloth born out of the soil with zero connection to the imperial empire, no connection to the Isles. Like that's not necessarily what we've advocated for. And I think I did read that article that Meaney did about the British identity and all the rest of it. And I think, he's made some foundational errors, but that is also with me having not read Ward's book. It's entirely possible that Ward is saying that the natural course of things is this kind of Republican Australian identity, just totally carved out from any sense of Britishness, which is funny, because the old, the digger, Billy Hughes said once that we're more British than the British. We had more British qualities than Britain itself.
I've actually got a very interesting Meaney quote from his paper on that, which we can go into in a second. Go for it. And this is as well to touch on this idea of ethnogenesis, because I think we also sometimes cop it from the ultra Anglophile crowd that you can't have ethnogenesis in 100 years or whatever, right? So you're still identical to an Englishman or whatever like that. But Meaney actually makes a very interesting point in his paper as to why Australians were so tenaciously British in their identity. And for him as well, British is, so as an academic, he's talking about Britishness as like a symbolic identity as well. So he's not really talking about it in a racial sense as such. He's primarily talking about it as a subjective identification. But this is the quote from the paper, so see what you think about this. He says, among the myths of the Western nations, that of, quote, Britishness or the British race was one of the most artificial and, on the face of it, implausible, especially in the British Isles. It incorporated the English, Welsh, Scots, and the Irish, each of whom had their own homeland, language, traditions, and ways of life. This British experience was not one of people, but of peoples in conflict. To a greater or lesser extent, the Welsh, Scots, and Irish bore a grudge against or felt animosity towards the English, who had forced them into the Union. As a gesture towards this reality, the myth sometimes appeared under the title of the, quote, Anglo-Celtic race, thereby almost admitting that the, quote, British were not one of people. In Australia, on the other hand, the transplanted migrants from the British Isles mixed together in their new homeland and in many respects homogenized their traditions, the English tending to prevail and the Irish Catholic to be the most resistant. Consequently, Britishness as an idea had more relevance for Australia than the United Kingdom. End quote from the Manny paper. What do you think of that, Grant?
Yeah, I think that's essentially true. There's an article on our wiki, on the ANA wiki, called Australian Sentiment, which is drawn from a 1908 copy of the Daily Post from Hobart, where this fellow is basically talking about Australian mindedness and Australian identity. He says that of the 5 nations which Kipling calls, which make up the empire, Australian sentiment, thanks to our lack of a long history, is free from many of the provincial and sectarian prejudices which the English, Irish, Scotch, and Welsh natives imbibe in their earliest years. And so basically the young Australian is born alien to a lot of these historical grievances that are in the British Isles. And so, and there's also just a kind of mythology that was constructed about the Isles, which I suppose didn't necessarily break Australian identity down on sectarian or sect lines, I suppose. Obviously, there would have been a bit of that hanging over with first and maybe even second generation migrants, but over the course of 3 or 4 generations, when you're raised up in Australia, I think it's much easier to feel like there is this kind of homogenous British identity on the other side of the world, even though those people on the other side of the world would be far less willing to adopt that identity on the basis of their ethnic distinction from each other. So yeah, I think that's a fair point. I don't think he's wrong. I think the trap is that people fall for, because Australian people saw themselves of British descent or British stock, that therefore they didn't see themselves as Australians either. I think the true answer lies in the middle, really, that they saw themselves as Australians of British descent.
We've got that famous quote attributed to Deakin. I'm not sure if he used it, but definitely used by Keith Hancock. Like, Australians are independent Australian Britons. Like that, depending on where the weight lies in that, like, is it more on Britain or more on Australian or more on independent? You kind of have a pretty wide, I guess, spectrum of where you can fall on this sort of question as to what the Australian identity is. I think it's, as well in terms of the ANA, we would kind of accept people across all of that. Even the historical ANA had, your full Republicans who would put a lot of weight on independent. We're independent Australian Britons. Or, your more nativist or radical nationalists, but not so Republican, I guess. Independent Australian Britons, maybe they're not even, maybe they've got mixed European heritage as well. And then your full Anglophile independent Australian. We are in Australia, but we're Britons.
Yeah. Yeah, the only bridge that's too far is we are merely British people in Australia. Like, that is just bullshit.
I agree, of course. Like, I mean, I wouldn't be just by virtue of geography and like, I mean, a big part of the Ward thesis is to do with our, the coming into contact with the bush and the way that the material conditions of the bush affected, a certain class of British people as they forged a new identity. Whereas even Meany says, by virtue of our geopolitical position, we were forced to protect our own political interests as a political community, apart from the empire as a whole.
Mm.
So
I think as well, obviously, to be fair, on the other side of the spectrum, there's like the extremist Jindy Roback people that would say we basically need to alienate ourselves from our British heritage and just become like Aboriginals, basically, just total whole cloth identity from the bush.
Or even putting like a pan-European identity against a British identity. I think that's, for me at least, that's the wrong way to approach it. I think it's more about the way that sort of how to put it, like Europeans that could be assimilated were assimilated into the British identity. I mean, myself personally, I'm not 100% British. I'm like 50, depending on how you count it. So, like, if I'm going to go home, I'm going to have to split myself in two, which is going to be a bit of a problem. But that's the way we're looking at it. So for me, of course, as a what was the old phraseology used by certain groups in Australia, as a mixed abomination? I have no alternative other than to identify primarily as a native Australian.
Well, it's not too alien to a lot of thinking, really. Like Henry Lawson at the end of his To Be Amused, he says, call in white men from all around the world. And you have Percy Stevenson writing that, the Teuton and, all these different European races have all melded into one in Australia. I think, I don't think that's really an offensive idea insofar as, we're not talking about large-scale Mediterranean post-World War II migration to a particular area where they will never assimilate or even be capable of assimilation is another question. But anyway, I think on the whole, like there is definitely a broad spectrum of like reasonable positions you can have on Australian identity without necessarily having to set fire to all your bridges to people. But one thing that must be accepted is that there is a discernible Australian type that has been essentially developed over a few hundred years of unique experience, which is most closely aligned with an Anglo-Celtic, cultural heritage, and that is the typified Australian identity.
Yeah, all right. Let's keep moving through our plan for this podcast. So I felt like it was worth doing one more quote from the Meaney paper, just because he does specifically call out Russell Ward and Russell Ward's book. And since that's the focus of this podcast, or at least what we're riffing on, I felt like it was worth talking about. So I'll read that one out. So Meaney says, quote, the only serious attempt to articulate an authentic Australian myth, that is a myth which could support an exclusive Australian nationalism, was Russell Ward's Australian legend. And in this work, taking his cue from Frederick Jackson Turner's American Frontier thesis, Ward developed a coherent myth about the formation of specific Australian qualities out of the experience of a nomadic tribe of bush workers, or, quote, noble bushmen, unquote, in the outback. Since the values embodied in this legend, such as mateship and suspicion of authority, derived from interaction with a peculiarly Australian landscape, they could be seen to be uniquely Australian. From the convict era to Federation, he traced the development of these characteristics and drew on bush ballads and short stories to illustrate their origin and nature. They seemingly owed nothing to a British heritage. But setting aside the question of the accuracy of the legend, that is not relevant to the nationalist issue, it would have to be said that this typology was never invoked by Australian leaders in their quarrels with Britain, or for the purpose of establishing a separate national identity. Australians very rarely appealed to the bush legend, or celebrated the bush songs and heroes on great national days, or at times in a great national crisis. On those occasions, the oratory, rituals, and symbols were overwhelmingly British in character. End quote.
Yeah, he's not wrong. I think if Ward was true, I mean, once again, have not read the book, but if Ward was trying to prop up this whole cloth Australian identity, which has no descendants from the Isles, I think is kind of rubbish. I mean, so much of our, like, even for instance, to talk about the union movement without involving the long history of unionism in like Wales and Scotland and England, and the use of folk music and all the rest of it in those union movements, would be just insane. I mean, obviously we have a cultural inheritance which flows forward into the Australian identity and Australian culture. It's just taken upon its own uniqueness, without it being invented out of whole cloth.
Yeah, for me, the interesting thing in this quote is that he acknowledges that Ward's got something going in terms of the values embodying this legend derived from interaction with a peculiar Australian landscape, so they could be uniquely Australian. So he gives that much, but the way he dismisses it as like some sort of foundation of authentic Australian nationalism is he says, "Oh, but it was never invoked by like Australian leaders or in their quarrels with Britain or anything like that." Well, I mean, like for me, it's just it's like this class analysis, but flipped the other way around, right? I mean, he's saying, well, the upper classes didn't really invoke it that much. I mean,
if the upper class didn't,
let's steel man his position. Billy Hughes was a union man and all of that, and Billy Hughes, as you said before, had that quote, "We're more British than the British," and that sort of thing. So okay, we can give that much. It's not purely that upper class people rejected it, but I think on the whole, that's kind of the class angle that's being taken there as well. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it's a bit silly to say if the elite of the era didn't whole stock and barrel believe in nativist cultural genesis, then it therefore doesn't exist. It's a pretty big bow to draw, and something I'm just not convinced by, really. I mean, there has been plenty of parliamentarians. I mean, all you have to do is look at the Hansard, even look at a lot of a lot of our A&A literature that we've republished, and clearly there is this idea of an ascendant Australian identity and Australian, an independent mindset within a kind of imperial framework for a lot of them. But there was definitely people on all sides of that spectrum we were just talking about a minute ago.
Yeah,
and it's only gotten more obvious as well with the passage of time. Long after Russell Ward's written his book, it's only become more and more prominent, or at least it's now probably in decline now, just due to this current situation we're in with being inundated with foreigners. But at least for a period before the turn of the 21st century, there was clearly an ascendant sense of Australian identity.
All right, well, that's a good segue into doing the other thing we promised we'd do, which was talk a little bit about Crocodile Dundee. So, obviously, as a movie, it's from 1986, I believe. But you look, Crocodile Dundee, famous Paul Hogan character. I think it's just worth discussing because, as I said before, it's one of the first things that often brought up by foreigners. Particularly Yanks, when what they know about Australia, how they base their conception of us, or what they base their conception of us on. A lot of Australians know it, and we can play it up a bit, of course, as well, which goes back to, I suppose, the way Ward says the typical Australian identity sort of conditions expected behaviour, perhaps, having a bit of a piss up and swearing too much and that sort of thing. But when it comes to the whole topic of invented traditions not being invented from whole cloth but based in reality, I didn't actually realize this before. I looked up a bit more about it before this podcast, but Crocodile Dundee as a movie is based on a real life experience of a bloke called Rod Ansell. And his experience was actually a national story in Australia. And that's where Paul Hogan sort of got the idea for this movie. Did you know about any of that?
No, I didn't. I assumed it was made up, but I choose to believe that it was all real.
Yeah, I'll just put in. Let me just find it up. So, what did it say? I didn't actually put it into the plan, but I did put somewhere. Have somewhere the what he said it happened to him. So let me just find it. Yeah, here we go. So this is just from Wiki. I just quickly looked this up. So the story goes like this: during he was off doing some fishing or something on the Victoria River. He told his girlfriend that he'd be back in a few months, and his boat ended up capsized and sunk by something big, which he claimed was a whale, which obviously is bullshit. But clearly this bloke was a bit of a bullshitter, and that feeds into the character of Crocodile Dundee in the movie. But anyway, he was stranded with no fresh water 200 kilometers from the nearest permanent human settlement, and one of his dogs had a broken leg. During the night, his dinghy drifted out to sea onto a small island at the mouth of Fitzmaurice River. And over the next 48 hours, he travelled up the Fitzmaurice on tidal flows, became seriously dehydrated, but eventually found some fresh water, subsisted on wild cattle and buffalo, hunted by day to feed himself and his dogs, reportedly resorted to drinking cattle blood as a substitute for water, with the fluids helping to maintain his body's electrolyte balance. And he also followed bees to their hive to retrieve honey. During the night, he slept in a tree fork out of the reach of crocodiles, although he shared the tree with a brown tree snake. At one point, he shot a 5-meter crocodile whose head he kept as a souvenir. Anyway, so basically, he makes it back, and that's the story, and that got onto the national news. So for those who have watched the movie, right, that's kind of the setup where the reporter from the US, the love interest character, has heard of this character, which, in the movie, of course, is Mick Dundee. And so she goes to check out if it's true.
Powerful.
Yeah, I mean...
It's like Davy Crockett hunting a bear as a kid, It's kind of like that. It's mythology. But it's also true, though.
Yeah, even with exaggerations, like, there's a lot in it that's plausible. And I think, you get that in the movie as well. Like, Mick Dundee, he's constantly, playing up his identity. So, you've got that scene where the reporter's looking away. He's just gotten off the boat, and he looks at his mate's watch to get the time. And then when she looks at him, he looks up at the sun. And he's like, "Oh yeah, 2 p.m. We better get going." He's like, "How do you know that?"
Yeah.
There's a lot of great comic moments because, of course, Paul Hogan, a great comedian, I think, of Australian culture. And if you haven't seen the episodes of the Paul Hogan Show, you should go and watch those. And Paul Hogan himself, in a way, is authentically an example of the Australian legend, apart from the character of Mick Dundee as well.
He's done well, and it's very much in his style. I think both between that movie and his show, he was obviously ventilating what he saw as the typical Australian character, which I think was not too far from reality. And if it wasn't, then it definitely helped shape and have an influence upon the trajectory of the Australian character. In some ways that are good and some that are bad, of course. But
in terms of the bad, like Rod Ansell himself, he had a very bad end. I mean, he ended up, like, he had a brief period where he owned some property and so on, but he ended up like addicted to meth, and then he was very upset about. He felt like he didn't cash out enough, I guess, on the Crocodile Dundee thing, and he ended up in a shootout with the police, and he got shot dead. And he was like a footnote.
It's a classic Australian end of biography. He got addicted to meth and died in a police shootout. Many such cases.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the dark side of the legend, and I've never really connected, I suppose, with the glorification of the bush ranger necessarily. I think, like, a lot of these characters, like Ned Kelly, Ned Kelly, one of our most famous sort of cultural exports as well. But I just, when I look into the history, I don't see him as being a particularly inspiring or even like a good character or person.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I think that's, and you have all the mythology spun around him as well, like this idea he was going to proclaim a North Victorian Republic, and the historical evidence on that is mostly fabricated and so on.
He didn't do nothing wrong. He was going to be an engineer.
He's just a good Irish boy.
Yeah,
hassled by the police.
Yeah, yeah.
Irish are black.
Yeah, yeah.
Proof that
As
Irish are not white.
that's right. Look, I do enjoy a bit of Red Gum, and Poor Ned is a banger of a song. But yeah, the mythology versus reality it's a bit different. But anyway, that's okay. We don't need to turn this into a Ned Kelly diss track.
Yeah, yeah. Um, anyway, I don't really necessarily want to go through the whole movie. Is there anything before I go into a couple of other things that stood out for me in it? Is there anything in particular you want to say about it?
Not really. It's just an enjoyable movie, and I think it's in that era, as I was saying, like around the bicentenary, like around 1988. Obviously, in the mid 80s, there was, I think, a much stronger sense of this unique Australian identity, which Ward, when he originally wrote his book, could hardly have dreamed of. I think really in the 80s, this ascendant Australian identity was really starting to kick off, and it was far more mainstream than it probably ever was, even in the cities. I think people in Sydney and Melbourne, they were watching the Hogs show, they were going to work in shorts, and they were growing mullets, and like obviously there's this point in time when the mainstream adopted this kind of casual Australian attitude to things, which I think when he was originally writing his book, in the 50s and 60s, I think that Australianness was far more relevant to the bush and the small towns and the country, and less so the city, or I think we saw in the 80s with Crocodile Dundee and all the rest of our masterpieces of culture and movie storytelling. I think we really reached an ascendant period at that time where even the mainstream was getting on board with Australian identity.
Yeah, for me, like the Peter Weir movies, Picnic at Hanging Rock,
Yeah.
and The Last Wave in particular. I love those movies, even though again, see, this is where it's it's a leftist kind of perspective in some of those works, or you could say that there is a leftist perspective in those. So, yeah, for those who haven't seen The Last Wave, go watch it. I think there's a deeper underlying kind of traditionalist point to be drawn from that movie and the capital T sense. So, yeah, if you're into your sort of like mythology and anti, destroy the modern world type stuff, look at The Last Wave as a movie and look at it from that angle rather than a post-colonial one. But anyway, yeah, look, a couple of other things for Crocodile Dundee for me. Like, for me, obviously you've got the incorporation of the Aborigines briefly, which is, you could say, a kind of Jindy nod, but it doesn't play a big part in the movie. Dundee participates in a corroboree and he's kind of like a initiated tribesman and that sort of thing. So that's kind of an interesting background element, I suppose, that Jindy nod. But for me, like the biggest takeaway from the movie, apart from loving the character, and of course he's a great expression of the legend, but the whole movie hinges around, apart from you've got the first half where he's showing the American Australia, and then he goes off to America to see what New York is like, and the culmination of the movie is he marries the American lady who's the journalist. And I gotta wonder, like, how much of it is this selling out of our, I guess, authentic Australian or British Australian heritage for like Americanism, and straight away getting hooked on the Hollywood bandwagon sort of thing. Because you've spoken before about how Hollywood sort of strangled our own film industry and that sort of stuff. So yeah, what would you take from that angle?
Yeah, look, I think, and that is true of a lot of the material coming out in the 80s, obviously. By that point, yeah, the American influence had totally dominated the media scene, which is not a good thing, which actually led, interestingly, a lot of Maoists in the 70s and 80s, just in their anti-American sentimentality, went really deep off the end with Henry Lawson kind of nativist Nazbol stuff. But that's the subject for another day. But it's interesting because like the Australian identity stuff can kind of cut both ways. Because yeah, it's definitely, we wouldn't say that we're keen on having our cultural material being dominated by the United States. I think as well, like, I mean, New York is a big city, but you know, Crocodile Dundee, I'm sure if he went to Melbourne or Sydney, would have a somewhat similar experience. He may not have gotten the chance to show some Africans what a real knife looks like, but it would still be an enriching experience. But yeah, you know, I still enjoy the movie for what it's worth. The Aboriginal stuff was interesting as well. I think in that period in the 80s as well, I think there was a far more positive attitude towards this kind of idea of reconciled Australia with Aboriginals. And so that would have just been thrown in as like a feel good kind of thing. So yeah, it's interesting. And I think as well, like in the bush, you probably have a more intimate relationship with Aboriginals, depending on where you are. I mean, my grandfather used to manage sheep stations out near Burke and Moree and far west New South Wales, and he never really had much positive things to say about Aboriginals because they used to steal his sheep all the time and eat them and vandalise the town. So I don't know how much that's true. Just by virtue of living near them, you're in a good relationship with them. It's probably more likely the bicentenary optimism about reconciling. But anyway, that's really all I have to say about the movie. I'd say it's still a good movie. It's worth watching. There's lots of other bangers from that time period as well, which are great watches.
Oh yeah, what are your top few?
Yeah, so other film recommendations for your viewing pleasure would include For the Term of His Natural Life, which is
based on the Marcus Clarke book. Then.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's the film adaptation of Clarke's book about the guy who gets sent to Tasmania as a convict. Another good one is Kings and Grass Castles, which was that book written by Mary Durack. It's basically following this Irish settler family that come over as indentured servants. Follows them for like 2 generations or something. It's great, just like a great 4-hour film. There's other good ones as well. Like there's other film adaptations of books by Bryce Courtenay, just various books about Australian life and different stories and stuff, which are all worthy of watching. But yeah, we actually have a ANA reading and film list. So if you look up the ANA reading list, there is actually a number of films on there which will be worthy recommendations for you to check out and watch.
Yeah, my viewing pleasure is a bit earlier, I guess, than the 80s for the most part. Yeah, like Peter Weir stuff, as I said before, Picnic at Hanging Rock, based on, again, a book. Like the Marcus Clarke stuff, it's a Gothic, Australian Gothic tale, which in itself is a kind of genre that I suppose epitomizes a lot of what we've been discussing. It's a fundamentally European genre in being Gothic, but since the actual Australian environment doesn't have any castles in it, the material has to be something else, and it's the sort of the harshness of the landscape and spooky Aboriginal stuff. So
yeah, that movie was a cracker.
Picnic at Hanging Rock, you've seen that one?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
That's an interesting one. That's very literary type work with all these bloody.
Sorry. Before I forget, because someone's going to listen to this and they're not going to check the book list, but another one is the film adaptation of A.B. Facey's A Fortunate Life. That one is also an excellent film and also a great book. But yeah, check them out.
Yeah, and The Overlanders is another one that I would recommend. I think often called one of the first meat pie westerns. So Western, but like an Australian one. So that's what a meat pie Western is. And that, I suppose, is another kind of Australian legend book because it focuses on the overlanding of cattle in World War II. So, the Japs are coming. we need to move this cattle out and sort of do this scorched earth defence, which was perhaps a bit premature. But they overlanded all this cattle from basically one side of Australia all the way to the other. And it's a very interesting movie, nice black and white one. Not too heavy on the story, but very nice imagery. I feel like we are quite naturally wrapping up. So any final comments?
No, just thanks for listening, everyone. And of course, if you're listening to this podcast, it's very possible that you've grown up your entire life and haven't really been exposed to much of this stuff. And please just indulge yourself in what is our heritage, our people's history for hundreds of years now. I mean, there's so many rich stories that we could be enjoying and feeling proud over, and just, hook in, stop downloading this foreign junk into your brain and get into something that's Australian, because there's plenty of stuff out there and there's no excuses for not having a crack and watching or reading or listening. There's plenty to go with.
Yeah, no worries. So standard exit to the show. Let us know in the comments what topics you'd like to hear about it from us, unless it's another comment saying, what's your opinion on Anglosphere unity and how we're going to restore the British Empire? So we've had about 50 of those, and there's not a lot we can do about it. Can say for the 50th time, listen to the Empire Day podcast. Yeah, but if there is a particular topic otherwise relating to Australia, the ANA, that you'd like us to do a show on, let us know. And yes, please do share our content, subscribe, like it, and all that stuff. Obviously, we'd love to share our show with as many good Aussies as possible. And if you want to reach out, you can find us at ausnatives.org. That's AUSNATIVES.org. All right, signing off.
This is my continent, this is my land, and yet the living dead that walk its streets, until its soil are not my people nor this land. Each day they walk and do not see the skies, each night they sleep and waking are too dead ever to dream, save when they seek to hear. In dreams some petty prophets rattle in coin, and yet we could so easily awake and dream, and feel in every stick and stone and leaf. In the whole earth and air of this our land, smoldering for the need of wind to set the flames alight, and leaping high to sweep and stir our hearts at bushfire speed, and kindle in our minds fires to kicks of nationhood. Once we have seen the sun through eucalypt leaves, with not one thought of oaks or pines behind the mind. Once we have drunk the sense of all the bush, with no book-colored smell of woodlands in the drought. Once we have felt this land and this land alone. As our whole world, our wealth, our strength, our life, then living blood shall course our veins anew. This land shall then know patriots worthy. Of its vast soil, no more shall petty slaves, each in his puny separate mind intent on his immediate ends forever dance colonial puppet jigs to distant tunes. No more shall this our people be divided, half blind and wholly dead, blind to their destiny. Then shall each one stand Australian mighty, in unity beneath Australian sky. To this land dedicated, all thought and strength, bent to the building here in nationhood of new life in this South, new life indeed, mighty with national purpose, strong with Australian